She said, hope is not happiness or confidence or inner peace. It's a commitment to search for possibilities. And I think very succinctly, she sort of galvanized what I was thinking about what hope is and what it should be as well, really. It's not this passive thing, it's an active thing, and it's the commitment.
We've all heard the phrase, hope is not a strategy. But what if that's only half of the story? My name's Andrea Sampson, and in this episode of Sense-Making Conversations, I'm joined by a globally recognized futurist and the author of Facing Our Futures, Nikolas Badminton. And we're going to explore what hope really means in a time of collapse, complexity, and reinvention. This isn't a motivational conversation. It's a strategic one. Nick shares why hope isn't just a feeling, it's an energy, a commitment, and a force for change. He shows us how we can use hope to move beyond noise, apathy, and the illusion that progress is the same as vision. If you stopped picturing a future worth working towards, this conversation might help you reimagine it with more intention. Let's jump into this sense-making conversation. Welcome, Nick. I'm so excited to have you here today. How have you been?
I've been really good. It's 2025 is certainly an interesting year. It's been really busy. I mean, whenever there's change in the world, and there's been lots of change across multiple continents and countries, things get interesting. So life is busy, life is interesting.
Interesting is an interesting word to use for the way this year has come about. I always love that, the Buddhist koan that says, may you live an interesting life. And some people call it a blessing and some people call it a curse. So
it's really interesting. You know, we're sort of in this, what some people call the fourth turning, which is a chaotic period of time. Luckily enough, by 2028, 2030, things are going to sort of enter into a new age of hopeful new beginnings.
Yeah. And Nick, I've known you for a long time, and the work you do is really incredible. The foresight work that you put out there in the world, the clients you work with, you're a futurist. You look at things through a lens that maybe is a little different than most people.
Yeah.
And I love that you've even just used the word hope. And it's the thing that I'm seeing a lot of your work is starting to shift a little bit into this place of hope.
Yeah.
And, we just started off talking about 2025 and the way that it's begun. And so tell me, what does hope mean for you right now, and why does it matter?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I started playing with ideas of hope just generally in conversations. Well, I sort of gravitated towards hope without really scratching too much below the surface. When I was writing my last book, Facing Our Futures, and I sort of was sort of realizing it was really important. And I've sort of been building on the idea of this. And on the first page of my book, back then, and writing it in late 2021, I called myself a hope engineer. And it's interesting that out of the entire book and all of the good writing and all of the frameworks and ideas, it's been the thing that people have hung their hats on and got really sort of drawn towards. So, we'll talk a little bit about what I'm doing next with that. But hope for me is something that's really, really important to elevate ourselves beyond sort of where we are today. I mean, without hope, we have nothing, right? So the idea that a deeply human emotion, a motivation, and in an area that's actually had a lot of work done to it in the area of positive psychology over the last couple of decades. So, hope to me means that it's an energy for change, and it's exciting to sort of talk to people like that because, there's a light bulb moment with them when I actually start going into it.
Yeah, I love that. Hope as an energy for change. That's such a powerful just way of thinking about hope, right? I mean, one of the things that I learned many years ago is when we start to think about our emotions, and hope, of course, is an emotional response.
Yeah.
Hope is one of those things that can actually pull us out of, those places that are maybe a little bit darker, or those places that are feeling uncomfortable. And this idea about it as an energy for change is powerful. So tell me a bit more about what that means in real lived terms for people. In your work as a futurist, how do you see hope as an energy for change?
So it's kind of interesting. If you look at some elements of futures theory, we're either sort of in a sort of a business as usual kind of trajectory, or we're sort of starting to hit our limits to growth, right? And then we're sort of faced with this challenging situation of like, we're either going to collapse and things are going to fall apart, or we're going to transform into something amazing. And this is based on a 4 alternative futures theory by James Data, a really famous futurist. When you start to think about that, are we business as usual? Are we hitting our limits or plateauing, or are we facing, destruction, collapse, or transcendence in a way? That hope through all of those has actually got a different volume, right? Business as usual, it's just there. We know where we're going. We know what goals we have. We know the pathway forward. We know what we have to do, the motivations. And when you hit the plateau, it dials down a little bit. And sometimes people even find themselves in a hopeless situation, or they feel that nothing can be resolved, or all of those challenges start mounting up against everything that we're trying to do. It might be market dynamics. It might be challenges in hardware and software. It might be political. It might be a number of different elements, right? But what's really interesting is, like, at times of collapse and transformation, you start really dialing up what hope means to us. And I found some books and some research, because the idea of a hope engineer sort of just struck me as a sort of an abstract concept. Mm-hmm. And obviously, through my training in applied psychology and a number of different areas, it sort of stuck in my mind somewhere, some sort of 30 plus years ago. And uncovered positive psychology. Charles Snyder developed hope theory in the 80s and 90s at the University of Kansas. And what was interesting was it was the first time that we sort of jumped beyond that theological or nice kind of philosophical idea of hope as a thing, which is a bit generic. And we know through life we've had people saying, hope is not a strategy, and there's books been written like that. And we've seen, all sorts of politicians use that to sort of get over, people that are overly optimistic or overly positive. But when you start to look at that positive psychology, you start to look at hope, it's actually really poignant and really powerful in the context of business and change in the world.
So, this idea of hope is not a strategy. And again, I mean, certainly coming from the corporate world, these are things that we often hear, hope is not a strategy. You've got to have a plan. You've got to have goals. You've got to have, and I think there's truth to that to some degree, but, I think what they're getting at when they talk about hope is not a strategy is this idea that what they're really saying is that hope is a delusion.
Yeah, exactly.
That we need vision. What's the difference? Like, is there a difference? And tell me more about that.
Hope is not scientific. It's a thing. It's just like this emotive thing. But with the rigor that came from like the psychological approach that Snyder and others sort of developed over time, they realized that actually there's a scientific basis for this and an application. The idea behind hope theory is that we set goals. The goals are a set of mental, physical, real world actions that we take to get towards something that's really, really poignant and important and impactful. And we need some routes forward, the pathways. Right? And really to frame that, there's a motivation, and really motivation comes from awarding agency not only to yourself, but to your teams and the partnerships that we make and the initiatives that we run as well. So those goals, pathways, and agency suddenly made people snap out of this, like, maybe hope isn't kind of this ethereal kind of thing, and as it sort of entered into the world of business, and there's not been a ton of work done on this, Andrea, but the work that's been done on it has been quite poignant. It's actually, more hopeful and optimistic leadership gets better results. It's very basic. We see leadership, and we see, people really stepping forward and stepping up. I mean, we see hope, we see optimism, we see drive, we see the fact that they do have goals and pathways and agency, and people follow that, right? And I think that is why I call it an energy for change.
I think what I'm hearing, and, having worked with a few positive psychologists, what I know about positive psychology is that, it is the practice that says, using positive reinforcement versus negative reinforcement is going to drive us forward. And that we have something called the belief motivation cycle that allows us to move through the work that we need to do. And when we get into that belief motivation cycle, we can very easily get stuck in that place of, I believe I can do something, I do it, And then I go back and reflect on what I've done. And if I am in a negative place, I'll get stuck there because I reflect on what I did. I decide it wasn't very good or it wasn't good enough or whatever. And then I go back and then I start to lose my belief. And so the question that came up for me based on that, because positive psychology is a powerful, powerful tool. And it has, while hope theory may not have had a lot of work on it, I think positive psychology, we're seeing people beginning to finally recognize the power of it. So do you see then hope as being a motivational input into that? Is it a motivator? Is that what hope is? Is that what the energy is?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of this as well. The agency is the motivation. It's also a commitment. So there's a great quote. There's an amazing author called Rebecca Solnit, journalist as well. And she wrote a book called Hope in the Dark. And she said, hope is not happiness or confidence or inner peace. It's a commitment to search for possibilities. And I think very succinctly, she sort of galvanized what I was thinking about what hope is and what it should be as well, really. It's not this passive thing. It's an active thing. And it's the commitment, right? And I think that's what's really, really important here, right? Even though it's been much maligned over time. I mean, how many leaders out there are talking like, we hope for the best? We hope for the best is like the worst kind of
right.
phrase.
Absolutely.
It's just kind of like fingers crossed, let's go.
Yeah, well, you'd be skewered in a meeting if you used that term, right? We're just hoping for the best. Like, hey, 2025, hey, we're hoping.
But at the same time, it's kind of got a naive sort of framing of the situation of like, if everyone hopes for the best and takes the best foot forward and has goals and pathways to reach those goals and has agency, hoping for the best actually delivers the best. And positive psychology, from a neurolinguistic programming perspective, I can do this.
Right.
I am that person. I manifest, right?
Well, I
all
think
these things can feel really hokey, but it's not. It's been proven time and time again to really accelerate leadership and thinking and people into the stratosphere.
Well, because what I think you're saying, I just want to sort of tease this out, is that, hope as a strategy, when we hear that, that frame, we hope for the best, there's a throwaway to that, right? Oh, I'm just going to hope.
Right.
But in reality, going back to the author that you quoted that said, hope is the commitment to search for possibilities, right?
Yeah, Rebecca Solnit, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, powerful term. It is the commitment to search for possibilities. So if we think of it in a business context, if I'm committed to searching for possibilities, what I've done is I've given myself, first of all, an end goal. I'm not just hoping that something will generally materialize. In order to have hope, I think what I'm hearing you say is you got to have, what is it you're hoping for? What is the thing you're hoping for? So that's key. And then if hope is used as a strategy, you're creating an openness within your teams, within your organization to search for the pathways that get you to that goal. And the hope is that you're finding them through the work you're doing. So it's hoping to get there, but with a clear commitment to get there.
Yeah, I mean, hope is not the strategy. Hope is one of the strategic motivators.
Good clarification there.
Yeah. And it really is important to clarify because, that reframing, that seems to make a lot of sense. And I've probably done something like 150 or so keynotes where I kick off by talking about shifting our mindsets from hype, all of those narratives that we've been told to believe, and whether it's like AI is going to change the world or this tech or that tech or these particular trends and whatever, but shifting from hype to hope, because hope is that drive to wonder, what if we make changes and deliver something that is better for the world in 10 plus years? Mm-hmm. And hope as the energy for change today. It's temporal. It actually travels across time, right? And I think that's really, really important. And time is this strange concept. But oftentimes, the mastery of time is often taught, and we see it in a lot of motivational speakers and the such like. But the mastery of time, the hope as an energy, and a number of different things are really, really important. And I always say that futurists are kind of time travelers. We sort of look at the signals, we look at the trends, And we take people to scenarios where we understand the dynamics. But the most powerful thing we do is we write stories. And that's where you really build in these story arcs that do have a sense of, hope and belief and the good old hero's journey, right? If you want to take something that's a little bit more of a Western frame. But even looking at indigenous story styles and whatever is different, and journeying and whatever and experience. I do think that it's really important there. And every time I've sort of worked on this and really, I constantly redevelop my practice, it always comes back to this: hope is an energy for change. And the next book that I'm writing is actually called The Hope Engineer's Playbook. And within that, it conjoins the world of futures thinking and hope theory. Wow. And I'm trying to build something that empowers organizations to explore and empower, the people that need to do the work, and to have like solid plans to execute against that on an ongoing basis. So it's something hopefully that's pretty practical from a framing perspective when you're doing projects and programs and making large investments and getting people on board with the big messages that you need for them to believe, right?
You've got so much there. Where do we even go into unpack that? Because there's so much that you're talking about. I mean, I want to go back to just for a moment. You talked about, as a futurist, you're a storyteller, and you and I agree on this, right? I mean, storytellers are creating our future. And you as a futurist, you're looking through different lenses to create the possible futures, right? You're moving beyond what's probable, because that's part of the job of a futurist, is to say, look, we can all see where we're going. That's easy. The straight line from where we are to the next 5 years is pretty clear, but that's not what we want. That straight line is often not real or not comfortable. And so as a futurist, you're saying, what about this? What if the future looked like this or this? And so that you really are developing hopeful scenarios. Like you're not saying to us, look at the dystopian future we could have. Let's go there. Right? I mean, I do know that there's lots of stories out there around that, but I think we would all agree that as a futurist, your job is to show us where, with small changes or sometimes big changes, we can change our future, and to find those hopeful places to go. And therein lies that sort of strategy or that strategic approach. Yeah. And then you talk about sort of this, the hope engineer being the bridge between futurism, foresight, and this, the pathway to the future. And so, immediately I saw this bridge between this idea of hopefulness, of futurism, and saying, look, I mean, we're living in a world that is moving so incredibly fast right now. So, this idea of hope being almost temporal, how can we use it to start to understand the next 60 days, the next, 90 days, the next year? Because we're now living entire years in weeks. It is such a crazy time that we're in.
Yeah, it's kind of a strange narrative to me that we're, everything's moving so fast. Everything is noisy. It's a lot noisier than it ever has been. The hype is running in cycles that are quick. Hype is running fast. Is the world changing quickly? It's interesting to see. We're kind of at a point where there's an intersection of, we've done the technological work over the last, 55, 57 years. I mean, and I use 55, 57 years because in 1968, Douglas Engelbart did the demonstration of the world's first personal computer, the online system in San Francisco. And what's really interesting is it takes that long to build things, and it takes that long to develop things. I mean, one thing I look at and I talk about is energy. And I've been doing a lot of energy and renewable energy transition talks, especially to big fossil fuel majors as well. It's been great. I've sort of snuck in the back door and having the conversations to shift investment with them as well. And I sort of put my hand up and said, when was the solar cell invented? And you look around the room and people just don't know where we came from to realize where we came to today. The solar cell was invented in around 1857. The first solar panels were installed on a rooftop in New York City in the late 1800s. And now solar, within 2 years, 3 years, is going to be the world dominant energy generation capability and absolute game changer and whatever. So when we talk about speed and fast and whatever, we can't forget there's been a hell of a lot of work to get there.
No question. But I think when we look at those technologies and when they were originally discovered to the adoption rate, I mean, look, if we look at any sort of an exponential curve, we move into that hockey stick moment and we're there, right? And so we're moving faster in that we as humans are able to understand things more quickly. Like 200 years ago or 100 years ago when solar was originally founded, it was like, what do we do with this thing? We had no ability to conceptualize even, what it was. Today, that adoption curve is much, much faster because, first of all, we've got more demand for it. I mean, 1800, like the electricity was barely around. So moving faster, I guess, is relative. And I hear you that, is time really moving faster? Yeah. Again, you get into some time theory. Time theorists will tell you it is moving faster. However, that gets into math that I have no ability to do.
It's kind of interesting to me. So coming back to where we are, it's a filter as well.
Yeah.
It's like, what do we focus on? Where do we step towards? And what's actually going to matter?
Yeah, and that's exactly where I was going. Is like, so regardless of whether time is moving quicker or faster, the point is, and I think from a hope perspective, because as humans, for the most part, we're just living our lives. We have families, we have jobs, and we're living in a world that is really noisy. And sometimes that noise is confusing, frustrating, scary.
That's right.
And so, how do we as humans adopt hope in a way that's helpful? How can we actually use that? And I mean, I actually want to just, before you answer that question, because I loved something you said and I don't want to lose it, which is hype versus hope. Hype versus hope. And even saying those two words, hype, hope, feel the difference of them. Hype, our body constricts. Hope, we relax. I actually think hype versus hope is the piece that is really key. Time moving quickly is hype. Hope is time slowing down. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's more considerate, right? So I'm in the middle of writing this book, the Hope Engineer's Playbook, and the framework and thinking about that. And I can always make frameworks really complicated. I wrote Facing Our Futures. It's got a complex and an incredibly powerful framework. And I've run teams through it, and it delivers a huge amount of results. It also takes a lot of time and energy to get through that, right? And what I'm realizing is that organizations want something that allows agility, right? So I'm trying to do something that's relatively simple, and there's sort of 3 stages to what I'm saying we should do, and the first is to explore, and the second one is to empower, and the third is to execute. And really the first one around exploration, right? That's the curiosity and whatever. But I'm saying learn the history.
Right?
The lessons, right? See the futures, do that futures work, go through signals and trends and scenarios and maybe even stories. Understand the wants. What do we want? What do we desire? What do we need, And then, in that exploration piece, it's like, we've got that frame. We know where we need to go. That's incredibly powerful. People can get on board. That's sort of fixed in a way, whilst we will update ideas of futures over time. It's kind of fixed at that point. And then when we step into empowerment, that's where it's like, okay, here are the big audacious goals that we want to follow. Here are the pathways to get there. Here's the impact we want to make, and here are the possibilities that we want to really explore. And that, to me, is where hope really rises, in terms of its volume within an organization. And that agency we start to give people starts to come through, and we start to execute against some of those ideas and plans that we put together with an underlying strategic frame of, okay, this is how we do it. This is where we're going. This is who's going to do that work. And fundamentally, over time, we have to keep that on course. Right? The most impactful organizations, and we know this from both having worked with many, many companies that are driving huge change that impacts billions of people's lives, right? Is that staying on course is probably the most difficult thing
Absolutely.
that you can do.
Absolutely.
But the hope piece is that energy to keep going, right?
Yeah.
The champions, the belief.
Right. Even in absence of results, right? Because I think that's one of the most challenging thing, because again, we live in this instant gratification world, right? Where it's like, I do something, I I should get an outcome. And sometimes we don't. In fact, sometimes it's important we don't, because we got to keep going. And, that hope piece that says you're 5 minutes from the miracle, you got to keep going, you don't know where you are. And so if you maintain that hope, it can maintain the energy, which then maintains the momentum.
It's the 10-year overnight success story.
Yeah, of course.
So in my keynotes, I tell the story of Douglas Engelbart that did this demonstration back in 1968, and Xerox PARC had developed it further. They created a computer that you could potentially buy called the Xerox Alto. But again, it was the early days of like the mouse, the desktop publishing, graphical user interfaces, Windows-based systems, object-oriented, all the things that we have been using for a number of decades now. But, there's a period of time, and in walks Steve Jobs with his engineer, says, "We love that. Can we give you some stock?" And the Xerox executives are like, "Sure, we're not going to do anything with it," because they just wanted more copies, right? And that's cool. But like, if you just look at Apple's trajectory, 1984, they launched the Macintosh at the Super Bowl with the big dystopian ad of like, the woman smashing the Big Brother screen and sort of taking it to the man, as it were. But look at Apple's runway from 1984 to 2025, right? Yeah. That is not a straight line. That is not an easy ride. In fact, Apple almost didn't exist by the end of the 80s.
Absolutely. Right? And I think why Apple is such a great example is, like to your point is like, okay, Steve Jobs, this force of nature, really, who came in with this vision, which actually created hope for a bunch of really computer nerds who the word didn't exist, like computers weren't really a thing. Right. And he created a vision that was really this hope for a future. He saw, he was such a visionary. The man may not have been liked a lot, but everyone will agree his vision was clear. And his story, of course, as we know, went up and down. But the reality is Steve hasn't been with the company or even with this world since, 2011, I think he passed away. So we're coming up on almost 15 years since he's left us. And yet the company itself has continued on. Why? Because what Steve created so incredibly powerfully was a framework of hope, not the vision of hope. Right. I think what he did was he gave a view, and as he brought in, Tim Cook, who runs the company now, he kept this process that said, we are a product company and we will always be a product company. Right. And as a product company, our job is to always envision what's next.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting to me, in the last 15 years, what have they delivered beyond slightly better phones and slightly better computers?
I would agree. But they've done it in a way that continuously moves. Like, it's interesting because I've heard that comment many times. But yet, when we look at the products that they put out, they have moved us as humans, right?
Sure.
It's been subtle. And it's like, it's interesting because if we go back to 2007 with the launch of the iPhone and, the brick that it was, but at the time, of course, it was incredibly revolutionary to what we hold in our hands today. And while the product itself, looks wise is a little bit different, but not fundamentally different, that has moved us. I think it has changed us as humans.
It's really interesting. So, when you sort of say, what have they done in the last 15? I think one of the most exciting products and the most challenging products they've delivered over the last few years has been the Apple Vision Pro last year. The idea of, pass-through augmented reality is not perfect. Yes. Very difficult. Again, what's really interesting is, like 1967, 1968, the world's first VR headset, the Sword of Damocles.
Yeah.
50-something plus years. In the 90s, VR was a thing. And,
I worked with Steve Mann at one point. The guy strapped a computer to his back and put glasses on and went to MIT. And what was that, like 1998, I think? Like, crazy.
It was like, I think MIT Media Lab, the wearable computing group, actually kicked off around about 1983, 1984.
Yeah.
I might be slightly off, but
But, like the vision, like these are people who have been visionaries. And I think, I work with, as I work with lots of scientists and academics. And I think when we come back to this concept of hope, it is the piece that I think is so incredibly powerful when you work with people who are in that place of creation, but creation through technology, creation through applied technologies, right? Is that they have this unwavering curiosity. And of course, coming back to your framework, which is explore, right? They need to have that curiosity. It is essential for them as scientists and academics. But then it's the application of it, which is that next piece. You go from explore to empower. And so, we see that. And I think that's what's really driven. And I don't know that if I were to ask Steve Mann or any of the other really famous people who have done incredible work in creating our world, if they would have said hope was a part of what they did. But if you listen deeply, I think what they described would be hope.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Steve is an incredibly good example here. I mean, his lab is just opposite the
is he still there?
Art Gallery, Ontario. I don't know if he's there every day, but I met Steve probably 11 years ago. In his University of Toronto lab, and he's very excited. He's a real activist for for waterfront here in Toronto, and a number of different. Guy's incredible. He's driven. Here's the crazy ones, and he's definitely
absolutely.
I think Nicholas Negroponte at MIT called him in the wearable computing group the lunatic fringe. But here we go. But I can't speak for Steve, but in terms of the people that do step beyond the realms of possibility into what comes next always have to hope for something that's better and something that's a little better than an incremental, slightly better camera or whatever. Back to the Apple piece with the Apple Vision Pro. What's really interesting is I think it's almost like a return to the basics of what Apple was trying to do to be truly innovative in a way, like in the 2000s or the 80s and 90s that came before it. Because suddenly we've got this, the hardware's been sort of shuttered now, but that's because something else is going to be coming, right?
Sure.
Difficult hardware, very expensive. It's like strapping a $5,000 computer to your face. It's never going to sell that well. But surgeons are using it to do better surgery.
Augmented reality in surgery is incredible. The work that's doing.
Yeah, it's actually super practical in a number of different ways, and it's immersive. And I think that, if you've ever strapped on a virtual reality headset, I think it's one of the first sort of emotional technologies, and therefore it sits very well with the idea of hope for something better as well. I met a journalism team from Al Jazeera, and they did this piece. I think it was in Guyana or Nigeria. I can't remember exactly which country, but it was about an oil disaster, and they'd done this reportage, but they'd built it all in virtual reality, and tears are streaming down your face. You sort of end the experience, and there's this profound feeling of what comes next. And I think that's what I'm trying to do with the idea of hope within a business perspective, is that the motivation actually does become a little bit more emotional. It does get high end. And that emotion, it doesn't dial down the scientific method or the engineering or the build that we have to do. It actually makes things more important. And a few years ago, I did an after dinner talk to a large engineering group, and all of the number of different group heads, for their business units were there, and the main CEO was there as well. And I asked them, do they talk about love as an essential business skill? And it was flawed. He came up to me, he goes, I've never thought about love, telling your employees that you truly love them, or actually saying that you really truly love the work that you do, and it has some gravitas and it's not just throwaway, it's powerful. And I'm not going to call this the love engineer's playbook. Love is still very, very difficult to put into a business scenario, but it's the same kind of feeling, right?
I remember reading a book, and it had to have been in the early 2000s. It was, internet is new, search engines are new, and Yahoo at the time was the key. Remember those days when Yahoo was what we used, right? And the chief innovation officer at Yahoo wrote a book, and it was called Love is the Killer App. And It's a phenomenal book. I go back to it every now and then. But I think this idea of emotions in business, and this is really what you're getting at, right? Is that I grew up in a time, I started in business in 1984.
Yeah.
It's a long time ago. We didn't have computers on our desk. We didn't have email. We didn't have the internet, right? And the prevailing wisdom was you show up at work with no emotions. Emotions don't belong at work.
Right.
And I think, in 2025 today, we can all agree that bringing only, a small part of ourselves into the office is not productive, and it's not helpful to anyone. And this idea of inviting not just hope, but love into our environment, really, it changes the way we show up. It changes the culture, it changes the people, and it changes the mindset. And so, if I think, I've got two questions for you, two last questions. One is, hope is one of those things that people either really lean into or they lean out of. And you've got people who are, like the optimist versus the pessimist.
Right.
And unfortunately, you see a lot more pessimists than you see optimists, because it's easier to be a pessimist. It's easier to be right when something doesn't work than to hope and, lose it. So how do you work with that? What do you do with that?
It's all about the amount of work that you want to put into it, right?
Yeah.
So pessimism is, the devil's advocate. I'm the devil's advocate. Just being the devil's advocate. It's like, well, anyone can say that something's not going to work, or it's easy to say, oh yeah, I knew that wasn't going to work, or whatever. These are people that haven't actually done the work and put it into that. So you might have a project that kind of got to a point where, you blew the budget, you delivered half of the functionality that you ever wanted to deliver, and everyone is angry, pessimistic about what comes next and whatever. And I got a reputation when I was a management consultant and a sort of technical sort of consultant as well, and a strategy director, as being a fixer. And we all know fixers in the workplace. The fixers are the ones that are willing to do the work. They're willing to be optimistic about delivering something no matter what, and to push through. The only way out is through, right? And the pessimists are the ones that saying it's never going to go. Let's just cancel it. Like lick our wounds and move on. They're not leaders. Right.
Yeah.
They might be accountants.
But how do you install hope in a culture where it's got a lot of pessimists?
Yeah. So let me tell you an example. So I joined a large consultancy called Capgemini back in the day, a French company, strategic, amazing. Really loved working there. I learned a lot and met a lot of amazing people. Anyway, within a week or two, I was on a plane to Ireland, sat with a client. They'd spent a ton of money. They hadn't got what they delivered. They were trying to implement some software that I was kind of a specialist in. And we spent 3 months reframing everything and showing them how it can be done. And it should have been done, and sort of, swallowing some pride and working it through. And, you turn the tide by actually going back to it. What are our goals, right?
Right.
What pathways forward? And in this case,
so it's follow the process.
Yeah. How do we do this? How do we deliver this function? How do we make this work? And then sort of, the agency, the people that we need. And it was interesting. We sold it. They ended up spending like 3 times the amount of money to implement the system. They truly got on board. There were still some skeptics, but not pessimists. There were skeptics. And that's fine, because skepticism is a test. It's reflected. We delivered it, and they ended up buying another project from the Irish branch of our consultancy, and it was 20 million euros or something. And it was like, the real sort of, it was sort of a heroic effort. And the client was like, we'll buy this, but as long as he sits here every day making sure it's delivered. So it still comes down to the point of like the guy, there's still a leader. There's still someone that's got more hope than anyone else, because whilst you may still have elements of pessimism or people waiting for something to go wrong, it's only because they've learned that it happens.
Right. What I heard you say there was that really, when you're in a culture of pessimism, the infiltration of hope is really through the demonstration of how it works. Like, do the work. Right. Do the work. Mm-hmm. And as you do the work, show the pessimists that the work is working. Keep being very over communicate, and bring them along. And the culture, it doesn't change overnight. Yeah. It's not going to change overnight. But again, this is where the commitment comes. It's got to be a commitment to hope, because over time it'll change.
Yeah, and I always say that nostalgia is one of the most painful things to have to deal with in futures work, because it's like we've always done it this way. I don't believe that there's a different way. There's nothing that can change, which generally doesn't age very well.
No, it doesn't take you anywhere, right? It just keeps you stuck.
Yeah.
Nick, this has been such a fascinating conversation. I want to leave the last question to you to tell our listeners, where can they follow you? Where can they find out more about this new book? When is it coming out? Tell us a little bit about all the things that you've got on the go where people can connect in with you.
I mean, you can literally type the word futurist on the internet and you'll find me. I run futurist.com. I run the think tank there. There's about 15 of us around the world that work with companies. So futurist.com, you can obviously type my name into the internet. I'm all over there. And I own nikolasbadminton.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. Please LinkedIn with me. I love to connect with new people and have conversations. I'm fairly active there. I don't really do too much on other social channels, but you can find me on my website. You can find me on LinkedIn, and you'll find me on the road. I do about 50 or 60 keynotes a year, and I'm working with some really incredible companies and agencies and governments about change. And now in 2025 and the next sort of 5 to 10 years, we need hope more than ever.
Yeah, we certainly do. Nick, thanks so much for all of your wisdom and your foresight and this injection of hope that I think everybody needs. This has been such a fascinating conversation. Thank you
so much. Thank you, Andrea. Always a pleasure.
In a time when fear is loud and the future feels uncertain, Nick reminds us that hope, real, structured hope, isn't naive. It's necessary. Hope gives us momentum, a reason to act, a direction to build towards. If this episode helped you shift your perspective or sparked something you want to carry forward, I hope you'll share it with a friend or someone else who's searching maybe for a little hope. And if you want more conversations like this about thinking differently, leading intentionally, and making sense of the complexity of our world, make sure you download our very next episode and subscribe to Sense Making Conversations wherever you get your podcasts.